the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Association recently denounced the cast review. They sent an email to over 1,000 members and banned further mention of the cast review on their listserv. So instead, they urged members to refer to WPATH's standard of care and the APA's policy statement on so-called gender-affirming care. So they are not at all happy with the cast review, and they want to just strike any mention of it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another LGB Alliance USA News Roundup. We are here with Joss and me, Ariane. Here's our summary of what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll update you on the Texas Children's Hospital scandal. Then we'll talk about the GOP's platform in regards to LGB and TQ plus issues. Next, we'll turn to California to talk about Newsom's signing of AB 1955 and the response. We'll also talk about how different orgs and authorities in Pennsylvania, the UK, and Canada are responding to or ignoring the cast review. We'll share the verdict of a Tennessee case allowing bans on sex changes on birth certificates, and we'll end by discussing backlash against DEI. First, we'll talk about the congressional probe into Texas Children's Hospital. So the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability is now investigating Texas Children's Hospital. This comes as a result of Christopher Rufo's reporting of a whistleblower's claims that Texas Children's Hospital engaged in Medicaid fraud while facilitating approval of medical gender transition procedures, including testosterone treatments. The subcommittee on government operations and the federal workforce chairman, Pete Sessions, who's a Republican from Texas, and the subcommittee on health care and financial services chairwoman, Lisa McClain, who's a Republican from Michigan, both signed letters sent to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The letters allege, quote, "We understand a TCH provider seeking to ensure Medicaid coverage of gender transition care appears to have fraudulently diagnosed a biological female patient with testosterone deficiency and hypogonadism in order to obtain Medicaid approval for testosterone treatment that would otherwise be denied under Texas Medicaid regulations if prescribed for the purpose of gender transition." End quote. I think this letter is a pretty damning allegation. It's saying basically that trans-identified patients are being diagnosed with, or fraudulently being diagnosed with physical medical conditions in order to bypass the ban on Medicaid funding for testosterone treatments for so-called gender-affirming care. So this has the potential for exploding into a really big scandal, and I'm curious to see how the congressional investigation continues. Now moving on to the GOP platform. So the GOP convention has been ongoing. I think it actually formally just ended. Trump gave his big speech yesterday. And in part of it, the Republican Party just approved a new platform. And it omits any definition of marriage as between one man and one woman. Previously, the Republican Party always maintained that marriage was between one man and one woman, and now they're not saying that. The platform also pledges to keep men out of women's sports, ban taxpayer funding for sex change surgeries, and stop taxpayer-funded schools from promoting gender transition. So perhaps this is a sign that the GOP is starting to see a distinction between LGB and TQ plus issues. If so, that's a promising development, and we'll see how that actually plays out. We'll see the Democratic Party, how they respond during their convention. But we think this is an interesting sign of change on the Republican side. Now, moving on to California, Gavin Newsom signed AB 1955. And we've talked about this bill a number of times before. Amongst other things, it bans school districts from instituting policies that require disclosing information to parents about trans-identifying children's decision to use opposite-sex names, pronouns, and facilities. So there was a lot of speculation about that Gavin Newsom might actually veto the bill because there was quite a bit of opposition. And I was actually involved with a lot of groups that were, a lot of people that were urging, actually went to the Capitol to object, who were calling Newsom's desk, telling him to veto, but he decided to sign it into law. And there's already a lawsuit that's being filed against this bill. The Liberty Justice Center is representing the Chico Unified School District and several of the district's parents. And the lawsuit alleges that the bill violates parental rights. So already this bill, it's not clear whether this bill is ever actually going to go into law, depending on how the lawsuit turns out. Chico, by the way, was one of the original counties that implemented a school policy that did require disclosure to parents about when trans-identifying students were taking on different pronouns and using the opposite sex restrooms, etc. So this AB 1955 was in some sense retaliatory against school districts like Chico. And so now Chico is suing California about it. Meanwhile, Elon Musk is now blaming the passage of this law for his recent decision to move SpaceX and X, formerly Twitter, to move their headquarters from California to Texas. Now, moving on to Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Association recently denounced the cast review. They sent an email to over 1,000 members and banned further mention of the cast review on their listserv. So instead, they urged members to refer to WPATH's standard of care and the APA's policy statement on so-called gender-affirming care. So they are not at all happy with the cast review, and they want to just strike any mention of it. Meanwhile, the British Medical Association, this past Wednesday, July 17th, the BMA, the British Medical Association, met to discuss their response to the cast review. Now, the New Statesman magazine had previously reported that the BMA was planning on voting to denounce the cast review. However, the BMA is trying to do some damage control and said that that report was misleading, but they refused to offer any details on what exactly they did vote on. And so there's sort of a shroud of mystery and secrecy about what the British Medical Association actually did recently in response to the cast review. And meanwhile, Manitoba, Canada, they seem to be completely ignoring casts. The government of Manitoba has declared that patients will no longer need 2 medical referrals to access gender transition services. And this was done to cut back on wait times. So not only are they not giving more of a pause or having more gatekeeping or safeguarding, they're actually only expediting the gender transition process there in Manitoba. So cast review is not penetrating there, it seems. Joss, it's up to you now to talk about other stories.
Thanks, Ariane. So a federal appeals court panel has ruled in a 2-to-1 vote that Tennessee does not unconstitutionally discriminate against trans-identifying people by not allowing them to change their sex, their designated sex, on their birth certificates. The plaintiffs in this case are 4 trans-identifying men represented by Lambda Legal in a lawsuit which claims Tennessee's rules subject trans-identifying people to discrimination, harassment, and even violence upon having to produce a birth certificate for identification. Tennessee Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti said, while other states have taken different approaches for decades, Tennessee has consistently recognized that a birth certificate records a biological fact of a child being male or female and has never addressed gender identity. In the majority ruling, Judge Jeffrey Sutton wrote, "There is no fundamental right to a birth certificate recording gender identity instead of biological sex." The plaintiffs could not show that Tennessee's policies were created out of animus against trans-identifying people, as it has been in place for more than a half century and long predates medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Further, Sutton queried, how could a government keep uniform records of any sort if the disparate views of its citizens about shifting norms in society controlled the government's choices of language and of what information to collect? Now let's talk about backlash. After pouring millions into their DEI initiative, Microsoft has joined the ranks of tech giants to dissolve their DEI teams and has reportedly laid off a team devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As reported by Business Insider, a leader of the team wrote in a company-wide email that true systems change work associated with DEI programs everywhere are no longer business critical or smart as they were in 2020. The email says that the DEI team was eliminated because of changing business needs. Other tech giants like Google and Meta led the way by eliminating or drawing down their DEI programs in 2023. By mid-2023, DEI-related job postings had declined 44% from the same time a year prior, according to Indeed. DEI programs burst into tech after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. According to Google CEO Sundar Pichai, the programs were initially created to build sustainable equity for Google's Black Plus community and externally to make our products and programs helpful in the moments that matter most to Black users. That is a quote. Both John Deere and Tractor Supply also announced the end of their DEI initiatives and their decision to stop participating in sponsorships for Pride festivities. According to the New York Post, Zoom, Snap, Tesla, DoorDash, Lyft, Home Depot, and Wayfair have also downsized their DEI teams. Conjecturally, what DEI programs were meant to be and what they have become may be the problem. I personally believe diversity, equity, and inclusion are great goals to aim for, but what we've seen take place is corporate expediency of virtue signaling and do-goodery, which results in non-lasting or useful changes. We've also seen in virtually every minority community the effects of trans activist appropriation of other communities. Newton's law of motion teaches us, in part, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In this case, the rise of trans activism to subsume every other major minority group has seen the rise in opposition from conservative activists like Robbie and Landon Starbuck, who went to great lengths to push John Deere in particular to abandon DEI and Pride initiatives. Do DEI programs serve a useful purpose? I absolutely think they do. And we need to see more diversity of thought in tech sectors. In fact, it's coming to light that AI-generated results tend to skew sexist and racist. Further, AI prevents open dialogue about problematic topics through self-censoring. The issues for all groups that would benefit from DEI programs have been overrun by gender activism. In the case of Pride, I'm not mad about corporations pulling support. Pride has become way too corporatized, and it would be nice for Pride to return to more grassroots local community events. What are your thoughts, Ariane?
Well, my first thought, and I've heard other stories that invoked the same thought in me, is when we talk about DEI, we're talking about such a broad umbrella. You know, we're talking about race, we're talking about sex, we're talking about gay rights, we're talking about all this trans stuff. And part of me is like totally not surprised that there's a backlash. And then part of me is wondering, okay, is at some point we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater about something? That's kind of where I'm at. What exactly, when they're getting rid of DEI, what exactly are they doing?
Yeah,
Who's going to be impacted by this?
right. Who's going to be impacted? So it seems like in the sense of Microsoft, they've just cut that program altogether. And a lot of these groups have either cut down the DEI programs that they had in place or just cut them altogether. So it's what you said about throwing out the baby with the bathwater is what we're seeing here. HRC and GLAD had good intentions, and then it just went sideways. DEI had good intentions, but then it's not enough to have a program that focuses on hiring more Black women or other minority groups. Then it became, it has to be a Black trans person, and it's all just so much. So in every single minority group, women, gays, Black and brown people, now it's not just about those groups, it's about trans and so it feels like just another way that to me it's very similar to the way the gay community has been. Pride is no more about gay issues, it's about trans issues. The trans flag is the forward facing flag, it's not the gay flag that we're thinking about or the agenda that we're even talking about anymore. It's the intrusion of those other things.
Yeah, I mean, and in tech specifically, I mean, it's kind of an open secret amongst people who know of tech that trans identified males are pretty overrepresented in tech. Women are underrepresented in tech. Blacks are underrepresented in tech, but trans identified males are overrepresented. So when talking about like Microsoft or something, trying to drag that trans issue into this whole DEI cesspool seems particularly bizarre. And another example that comes to mind, it was, I want to say it was somewhere in maybe Minnesota, or maybe it was one of the Dakotas, like North Dakota. It was some university where maybe it was a department or something, had a policy where they decided to ban the professors from putting their pronouns in the signature. But they also banned professors from putting their tribal affiliations in the signature, when like a Native American tribal affiliation. And I was trying to scratch my head about that, because I know in the case of Native Americans, there's this huge problem with people faking a Native American identity or exaggerating one for DEI related purposes. But it's also the case that there are some people who have real tribal affiliations that actually may be relevant for something. And so that was an example of a story where I would have liked to have seen more rationale for what's going on, because I can't help but be concerned that this might also be a throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing if we're not careful of where exactly we're targeting these interventions.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's that zeal and the gusto about pronouns, about gender identity, about identity in general. And we do see, unfortunately, routinely, people just assuming an identity that doesn't belong to them. And I don't understand the psychology of why people do that, but we have people who call themselves lesbians that are not lesbians. We have people who call themselves all sorts of things that are not those things, and appropriate that community and take the opportunities from the people that would need it from that community. And like you said, it is a disproportionate number of trans identifying males who are in tech. It is a useful tool for them to take on these identities or to use these communities to further their own personal goals.
Yeah, and with the faking identities things, I mean, that's so easy too when you include stuff like queer and non-binary. Like anybody can really call themselves that. And so if you're going to have a DEI program to support LGBTQ plus representation, how are you going to, just maybe what's going to happen is a bunch of people are going to call themselves queer for
And they
and
do.
that's their DEI quota. I
Right.
it's just I don't see how any of that could work.
No, and maybe that's what they're coming to understand. Maybe it's just become a little bit too much to try to acquiesce to all of the demands. The programs seem to start from a good place, but then morphed into these things that were maybe unsustainable also for these corporations. It's more expedient for them in that moment in time. They're like, got it, DEI, we're going to up this. We need to see more Black and brown folks. And then it was like, oh my goodness, now we have to also focus on women, and we have to also focus on gays. And now in all terms, we're focusing on trans issues and gender identity and pushing that forward, and how do we make everything acceptable for everyone. And there's really no pleasing everyone all of the time. But then on a corporate scale, they don't have to if they don't want to. They can just be like, okay, this is costing us money, we're not making money.
Exactly. And I think part of it too, like it's when you establish DEI, it starts as like an ideal or like just a trajectory, like this is what we want to do. But what it happens is it metastasizes into this bureaucracy, into a professional class, and that's inevitably going to be corrupted with all sorts of bizarre ideology and money interests. And, people who say, hey, hire me for a certain amount of money and I'll help you with your DEI policy. And so it sort of just becomes embedded as into the corporate world as part of the corporate world and all the games that the corporate world plays. And it just it becomes part of the problem rather than the solution.
Exactly. And I'm a major nerd. I play a lot of games. Like I'm just, it is what it is. One of them is Pokemon Go. And in Pokemon Go, they had a whole DEI revamping of avatars, and it was horribly received by the community. I mean, absolutely horribly received by there's a handful of people that were really excited about it. Most everyone else loathed it. And that was just another check to me in these failures by tech to take these DEI group initiatives, like you mentioned, to these organizations. They had a whole team of DEI specialists that were paid to help them bridge the gap and become more inclusive. And then they unveiled it on the community, and everyone was just like, no, this is terrible. This is the worst thing.
I'm just curious what DEI Pokemon Go would be. Did they make like Pikachu a different color or something?
What they did was they took the avatars. So they had two standard avatars that were very, how to put it, Caucasian-y. Now they've added in, basically they took away sex as a category. Now you can just change your avatar to have breasts or not have breasts, to have hips or not have hips. And all of the faces are very juvenile looking. Like there's just a lot of problems with it. It leans very heavily to pleasing maybe pleasing the aesthetic of trans identified males. And so very heterosexual, not trans identified males have been very vocal about this not being okay. And they're the community that is pretty much the most aggrieved about this, because they're seeing instances where they can't make themselves look masculine anymore. They can't make themselves look like a male character. Everybody's just kind of gender neutral in that sense. So they've made some adjustments here and there, but over and over and over again, these things are being done. And sometimes they're just kind of fly under the radar, but in this case, this was really horribly received, and they are just riding with it. And they paid a lot of money for a DEI consultant to tell them this is what you should do.
Wow, that sounds pretty comical, really. We're curious to hear your thoughts, you there in the audience. If you would like to share any thoughts, please do so in the comments about this story or about DEI, about any of the other stories we do. And thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of our LGB Alliance USA News Roundup. We hope to see you again next week.